For a while, the Raw guest host era felt like World Wrestling Entertainment trying to turn Monday nights into a revolving red carpet. Every week seemed to promise a new celebrity, athlete, television personality, or pop culture name stepping into the center of the show and temporarily running it. Some weeks it felt chaotic, some weeks it felt fresh, some weeks it felt like a publicity stunt wearing a suit and holding a microphone. But whether people loved it or hated it, the guest host concept became one of the most recognizable experiments of its time. That is exactly why the era is still worth talking about. The guest host format did not appear out of nowhere. It arrived in the summer of 2009, right after the company had run a high-profile storyline in which Donald Trump purchased Raw. When that angle ended, the company used it as the springboard for a new idea. Instead of one permanent authority figure, Raw would have a different guest host each week. Later company retrospectives made that connection explicit, noting that Trump departed Raw after instituting a guest host plan modeled in part on the kind of weekly personality-driven attraction associated with The Apprentice. In other words, the concept was not random. It was a deliberate attempt to make Raw feel like an event every single Monday. And on paper, the idea made sense. A rotating host system gave World Wrestling Entertainment a built-in promotional hook every week. It created easy mainstream crossover opportunities. It gave the company a fresh face to advertise, even when major storylines were in transition. It also matched the period because celebrity appearances on wrestling television were hardly new. The company had long benefited from outside names bringing extra attention to its shows, and the guest host era was basically that idea expanded into a weekly format. Bob Barker hosting Raw in September 2009 is a perfect example. The entire episode was built around his personality, his game show image, and the novelty of seeing him run the show. That was the formula in its purest form. For a while, that novelty worked. The guest host system made Raw feel unpredictable in a very specific way. Fans did not just tune in to see the wrestlers, they tuned in to see who was running the show that week and how that host's personality would shape the episode. Some hosts were there for comedy, some were there for publicity, some were there because they had a genuine connection to the company. And occasionally, the format produced memorable moments, like Bret Hart being announced to host the first Raw of 2010, a development the company itself treated as a major event. In those moments, the guest host concept felt useful because it could turn a single appearance into a larger attraction. But that is also where the format's biggest weakness started to show. The Raw guest host era gave the show a new weekly hook, but it also made Raw feel less stable. A wrestling program usually depends on recurring power structures. General managers, commissioners, owners, and authority figures work best when they create continuity. They carry stories from week to week. They create consequences that feel like part of the same world. The guest host format did the opposite. It reset the tone every Monday. One week might feel comedic, the next week chaotic, the next week promotional, and the next week almost disconnected from whatever had happened before. That kind of instability can be useful in small doses, but it is hard to build around for long. A weekly show needs more than surprise, it needs momentum, and that was the problem with the guest host concept. It created short-term curiosity at the expense of long-term coherence. When a host was entertaining, the episode benefited. When the host felt disconnected from the roster or from the tone of the show, the whole experiment could feel like a detour. There was also a deeper issue. The more Raw became dependent on outside names, the more it risked sending the wrong message about its own cast. World Wrestling Entertainment is strongest when the wrestlers feel like the main attraction. The guest host era sometimes enhanced that by giving the roster a new foil or a new authority figure to react to. But just as often, it shifted attention away from the wrestlers and towards celebrities who were only passing through. That is a dangerous trade-off. A wrestling company can borrow star power from outside entertainment, but if it does that too often, it starts to undercut the idea that its own performers are the stars people should care about most. And eventually, the company moved away from it. By June 2010, Raw had shifted to the anonymous Raw general manager concept, replacing the revolving celebrity host format with a more regular authority mechanism. That change matters because it tells you what the company ultimately needed. It needed consistency. It needed an authority structure that could exist every week without requiring a new outside personality to carry the show. The guest host idea had generated novelty. But novelty alone was not enough to anchor Raw indefinitely. That is the real reason the Raw guest host era ended. It did not end because the concept was useless. In fact, it served a purpose. It created buzz, generated crossover publicity, and gave Raw a different identity for a while. But it was never the kind of format that could sustain the show forever. It was too inconsistent, too dependent on outside names, and too disruptive to the kind of week-to-week structure a wrestling program usually needs. In the end, the Raw guest host era is remembered because it captures a very specific company instinct. The belief that Monday Night Raw could become even bigger if it borrowed a little more from mainstream entertainment each week. For a while, that instinct produced curiosity and attention. But over time, the experiment revealed its limits. The guest hosts made Raw feel different. They just did not make it feel durable. And that is why the era happened and why it ended. It happened because World Wrestling Entertainment wanted weekly buzz, celebrity crossover, and a fresh promotional hook. It ended because a wrestling show still needs continuity, identity, and a power structure that lasts longer than one night.